Well, hey, everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to today's show. Now, in 1994, public policy analyst Dan Greenberg wrote, "It is difficult to overstate the extent to which term limits would change Congress. They are supported by large majorities of most American demographic groups. They are opposed primarily by incumbent politicians and the special interest groups which depend on them. Term limits would ameliorate many of America's most serious political problems by counterbalancing incumbent advantages, ensuring congressional turnover, securing independent congressional judgment, and reducing election-related incentives for wasteful government spending. Perhaps most important, Congress would acquire a sense of its own fragility and temporariness, possibly even coming to learn that it would acquire more legitimacy as an institution by doing better work on fewer tasks." And that's just one quote. We can get similar quotes right from the U.S. term limits website, which are very similar in nature and basically say, yeah, we do need term limits. It's a good thing. And I've been hearing the debates most of my adult life. And today I'm going to, for the first time, talk to somebody who really knows something about it, right? So, why term limits? And what is being done today to build the momentum for a national term limits amendment proposal convention? Well, joining me today is the executive director of U.S. term limits, Nick Tomboulides, to discuss this topic in more detail. Hey, Nick, and welcome to the program.
Hey, Robert, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You bet. All right. Well, I think I already answered my first question in that introduction, but I'm going to ask you, why term limits? How is this going to make the political system better?
Well, in my view, term limits is a way primarily of bringing innovation to government, right? I mean, we look at our society and we see that there's innovation across the board in basically every area. In the last 30 years, we really revolutionized, the way we work, the way we communicate, the way we travel. It's all been improved. Things have gotten better. And yet, for some reason, when it comes to government and politics, things have gotten worse. We have the same people in Washington who are doing the same things, and they're failing to solve problems. We're now multiple decades into this experiment with career politicians, and they have not solved a single national problem. In fact, every single problem we have has gotten worse. I mean, we see nothing but increased deficits and debt and dysfunction at the national level. They failed to solve our healthcare problem, our immigration problem, the problem with our national finances. And as the old saying goes, it's the definition of insanity to keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And so what we're looking to do with term limits is to chart a completely new path, get rid of the broken system that has failed of career politicians who are more interested in self-service than public service, and open up the system so that we can get new voices and new ideas, people from all sorts of different backgrounds who are willing to contribute, who have the experience we need to solve problems and are more of their time than a legislator who's been in Washington for 30, 40, or sometimes even 50 years. And what I'm suggesting is it's not exactly a new idea, right? Because at the founding of our country, we didn't have career politicians. We have people who come from many different backgrounds. At the beginning, it was farmers and innkeepers and lawyers who would come to Washington for a very short time. They would get the job done. They would change the system before it changes them. And then they would go home to live under the laws that they made. But over time, it has mutated into a permanent political class. Career politicians, like I said, they haven't solved any problems. They are the problem. What started out as a very temporary assignment in Washington has become a career for all too many, and has become more about getting reelected and building these empires of power in Washington, D.C. than about serving the people. So we want to get public servants back in government. We want people who are in it for the right reasons. We want to challenge that power of incumbency, create competitive elections, and we really want to open up the system to see innovation in government and see that we, the people, are finally represented again.
Right. And I believe that Congress was meant to be a citizen legislature. And don't you think George Washington set the example right from the beginning? 2 terms and I'm out. No, I'm not going to be a king. That's what we fought the Revolutionary War for, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
George Washington, they called him the virtuoso of resignations because he had 2 opportunities to become a king. Right after the Revolutionary War, he could have done it, but instead he resigned his military commission. And then after his second term as president, he could have kept running. And once again, he declined to do that. And I think in the process, he became the symbol of American ideals, because what separates our country from every other empire that ever existed before us is that here it's the rulers who serve and the people who rule. Well, at least it's supposed to be in a republic, but I feel like that's been lost over time. We've gotten away from that founding ideal, and it's something that we need to get back to.
Yeah. Well, now the president does have constitutional term limits. That's been going on for about 7 decades. Many state governors, our governor here in the state of Florida has the term limits, right? State legislatures, but not the U.S. Congress. And they're just never going to vote for such legislation, right?
Well, it's interesting. They won't vote for it without a lot of external pressure, right? If they feel free to vote against it and keep their seats and keep getting reelected, then that's what's going to happen. As you know, 95% of incumbents to Congress get reelected. They don't have a lot of trouble with that. So there would have to be a tremendous groundswell of pressure coming from the people. I mean, as you alluded to earlier, term limits is the most popular political idea in the country, the most popular policy. 82% of Americans support it, and it's completely nonpartisan. So that includes 87% of Republicans, 83% of Democrats, 75% of independent voters. It doesn't matter. The popularity is so broad. And so I think you could see a situation where if Congress is truly held accountable on the issue and people refuse to vote for Congress members who, for example, have not signed the U.S. term limits pledge to support an amendment or will not support term limits, then something may happen. But I'm not going to hold my breath on that, on the chickens voting for Colonel Sanders. I think a much better approach is to go through the state level and put real pressure on Congress by having state legislatures call for term limits on Congress, which is something that they can do under Article 5 of the Constitution.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll dive into that in a few minutes.
Sure.
But what I always found interesting is the framers of the Constitution never found it necessary to put term limits in the Constitution. Why do you think they chose to do that?
Well, it's interesting. If you go back and look at the notes from the Constitutional Convention of 1787, there was some debate over whether there should be term limits for Congress. The Articles of Confederation, which was our first constitution, did include term limits. And among the framers who supported it were people like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, in fact, had actually insisted on term limits for members of the Pennsylvania legislature when he wrote the Constitution of that state in the very early going. So it was, from my understanding, it was a very close call. But the ultimate reason, I believe, why it was not included is that they just didn't find that it was necessary, because it took back then a lot of foresight to even understand, to wrap your head around this concept of a career politician, right? Because people were living into their 40s, right? So the idea of being in Congress for 30, 40 years, that was completely off the table. They received very low pay. It wasn't this super sensationalistic job that it is today, where you get private jets and wined and dined by lobbyists and everyone holds the door open for you and laughs at every single joke you tell. It was very unglamorous. And so back then, they kind of had the opposite problem, where instead of having trouble getting bad people to leave, they had trouble finding anyone who was willing to run for Congress. And up until about 1900, the average tenure of a member of the U.S. House was only around 4 years. And so for the majority of our country's history, we didn't have career politicians. That's a relatively new phenomenon. But I will say this, going back to the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson was not in Philadelphia when it was written, but he was working as an ambassador over in France at the time. However, when they sent him a copy of the Constitution for the first time, his note back to the States was, I think you've done a good job with this, but I'm going to predict that the abandonment of term limits, the abandonment of rotation in office will end in abuse. And I think we can all say that was pretty prophetic.
Yeah. So let's get down to the nuts and bolts. What is U.S. term limits looking for as far as the amount of terms for a representative, the amount of terms for a senator?
One in office, one in jail. No, I'm just kidding. The real proposal that we're looking at is 3 terms in the House. So that would be 6 years, and 2 terms in the Senate. So you could do 6 total in the House, 12 years in the Senate. That's if you're able to serve in both chambers. Now, granted, most people are not able to move from the House to the Senate just because the sheer number of seats, there's not enough room for all of them. So it would be 6 years in Washington for the vast majority of people, and then you couldn't run again. And we think that it really strikes the right balance between allowing someone to get enough experience to understand the position without growing stale, without growing out of touch, and living in the pocket of lobbyists and special interests in Washington, D.C. You're severing those connections quickly enough, and you're allowing for new blood, new ideas to enter into the system.
So how does U.S. term limits and Nick plan on going about this? I guess we could start with what is Article 5, and Nick, Can you go ahead and try to detail the process the best of your ability?
Yeah, sure. I'll do my best. Article 5 is the section of the Constitution that allows for amendments. The framers knew that there would be errors that would be found in our system of government that would need to be corrected. And we've done that 27 times before through amendment. And the Supreme Court has said that term limits for Congress have to be done by constitutional amendment. So Congress could not pass a simple law, a simple statute for term limits. It has to be an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, rather, which requires additional steps. And the 2 ways to get it done, as you've got displaying there, you can get a 2/3 vote of the House and Senate. That's the turkeys voting for Thanksgiving approach that I alluded to before. Or you can get 2/3 of the state legislatures to call for an Article 5 convention. So that would be 34 states calling for a convention to term limit Congress. And when you do it that way, Congress and Washington, D.C. and the swamp have no say in the matter. The states are actually able to do an end run around Washington and obtain term limits for Congress on their own. And that's a very important point, because when you take all that Washington self-interest out of the equation, when you take Congress out of the equation, you have a completely different set of incentives. Whereas Congress doesn't want term limits. They're trying to protect their empires, protect their power. Many state legislators are open to term limits because they're looking at this from the perspective of, hey, I may want to run for Congress someday, but I can't because I'm blocked by this incumbent who's been around since the Paleolithic era. So I think the incentives are very different. And what it takes is getting 34 state legislatures to pass simple resolutions calling for a term limits convention. We've got it done in 5 states so far. We've passed it in Florida, Missouri, Alabama, West Virginia, and then this year, Wisconsin just came online. We've also gotten a single chamber in 6 more states: Tennessee, Louisiana, Utah, Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. So I believe that's going to be the next batch to come online. And what you might see is you don't necessarily have to get all the way to 34 states before Congress sees the writing on the wall, realizes that this is inevitable, and decides, hey, we have no choice but proposing this amendment ourselves. And so what we're looking to do is get as many state legislators on board as possible. If you go to termlimits.com, we have a pledge for candidates for your state house or your state senate to sign to indicate their support for the congressional term limits convention. We also have a pledge for those who are running for Congress. If they want to support an amendment, we just hit 100 incumbent members of Congress, actually, who have endorsed our amendment. And so there's really two ways to get it done. But we think that the secret sauce lies in the power of states because, like I said, they don't have that conflict of interest and they're far more motivated to do the right thing. As well, state legislators are a lot closer to the people, right? Like you see them at the grocery store and you can, grab their arm and say, hey, I want you to vote this way on a bill. Whereas members of Congress are much more distant and I feel a lot more out of touch and difficult to reach. So we've had a lot of success in the early going with this strategy, and we're going to be upscaling it over the next year or so, and you're going to see a lot of national momentum behind this issue.
So how long do you think this is all going to take, though? Because you mentioned 5 states are on board already. So we're still a far way off. Are we talking years?
I think we're looking at between 2 and 5 years. That's my projection, because as certain states come on board, you're going to see that they've blazed the trail. Other states are going to want to join in to be part of the momentum, be part of the movement. We're doing all we can to expedite this by going out and conducting citizen education campaigns in these states. So, for example, in the state of Arizona, they had a primary very recently. We had passed the state house in Arizona, but not the state senate. And we sent out mailers telling people these are the candidates who signed the U.S. term limits pledge, and these are the candidates who refused to sign it, who refused to support the convention, to support term limits on Congress. And believe it or not, Robert, 4 of the incumbents in Arizona who blocked the term limits convention were actually defeated over their opposition to the issue. And so, in my opinion, that is the real winning formula, right? If you can't make them see the light, make them feel the heat. And we're doing that in Arizona. We're doing that in every state where we're hitting roadblocks right now. So I would say realistically, it's probably a 2 to 5 year plan, but Congress might see how many people are being mobilized and might see the progress that we're making, and they could jump sooner than that, especially depending on what happens in the next couple election cycles.
Yeah. Now I see that I think it's Ted Cruz in the Senate has a resolution there, and then there's an equivalent one in the House. The numbers are still so. And then you also have this pledge thing that U.S. term limits is doing, and that's actually how I found you guys. You've been sending me emails about people in Florida signing the pledge, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I looked through the names, and I didn't really see. I may be wrong, but I didn't see any Democrats. If I'm correct, is this because they just have no interest, or you're not contacting them? What's the story with that?
Well, I can tell you we're absolutely contacting them because we contact all of the candidates. With Democrats, there's a definite disparity between the percentage of Democrats in general, like Democratic voters and citizens and activists who support term limits, versus the percentage of Democratic candidates and office holders. So we know from the national polling that over 80% of Democrats support term limits. All of my Democratic friends, for example, support term limits. I happen to be an independent, but every Democrat that I know supports term limits. And yet the numbers are not quite as high among elected officials. But we do have some. In Congress, Representative Jared Golden from Maine is a Democrat. He has signed our pledge. He has co-sponsored our resolution. Also, Congresswoman Lori Trahan in Massachusetts has signed the pledge, and Kirkpatrick in Arizona. Among state legislators, we do see a lot of Democratic support. So, for example, when we had a a vote in the Utah State House, a higher percentage of Democrats in the Utah State House voted with us than Republicans. Possibly because Orrin Hatch, a Republican senator, had been elected from Utah for so long.
Right.
So there's a definite gap there, but we're working as hard as we can to close it. We're a completely nonpartisan organization. We have people of all different political ideologies who work here. And we emphasize issues of accountability and making elections more competitive and stopping corruption, because we think those are concepts that everyone can believe in, regardless of your party affiliation. I'll give another shout out to a Democrat in Florida, Geraldine Thompson, who is she just got elected to the state Senate. When we had our vote on the term limits convention just a couple years ago in Florida, she saved us on committee. We were about to be defeated on committee, and then she voted with us and broke the tie and allowed it to move to the Senate floor. So she's one of the best champions that we have of term limits around the country, and she happens to be a Democrat. So, yeah, we're working on correcting that disparity. But you, as you pointed out, it definitely does exist.
Yeah, but I also noticed, the big dogs haven't signed up either, like McConnell and Schumer. Never, right? Yeah.
No, we put out on April Fool's Day a few years ago, we put out a press release that Mitch McConnell had signed the U.S. term limits pledge. But if there's one I wish I could have back, it's probably that, because I got all these calls from like reporters and authors who said, really, Mitch McConnell is for term limits? I said, no, of course not. It's April Fool's. Mitch McConnell is so opposed to term limits that he has actually filed bills to eliminate the president's term limits, which is extremely radical. I mean, even members of Congress typically who oppose term limits on themselves, they're hypocritical. They still love term limits for the president, even though all the same arguments apply. But Mitch McConnell, I mean, he's at least consistently bad. He opposes term limits for Congress and opposes term limits on the president.
That is hilarious.
It's unbelievable. And that's the guy who's probably going to be in charge of the Senate for the next 2 years.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Nick, I want to go ahead and give you a chance to talk about U.S. term limits, the organization, and the great work you do. So I'm going to go ahead and give you the floor.
Sure. Thank you, Robert. I really appreciate that. I'll just say that we don't get a lot of help. Actually, we don't get any help from the political establishment. The leadership in Washington doesn't like us. Both parties don't like us. Lobbyists don't like us. Bureaucrats don't like us. We would not be able to exist if not for support from just the average citizen. That is our strength. That is our base, regardless of party. We need people. We need boots on the ground. We need activists in Florida and beyond who will send an email to a candidate asking them to sign the term limits pledge, who will make a phone call to that candidate asking same, or show up at the town hall meeting and ask why this candidate hasn't signed the pledge. That is our bread and butter. That is our stock and trade. We could not exist without support from individuals. And so if there's one thing out there that you can do, if you want to fix this broken system, if you're disgusted and appalled by career politicians as I am, go to termlimits.com, sign the petition. That will put you into our loop. So if there's activity, if there's happenings in your area, if we've got a candidate locally, local to you, who is on the verge of signing the term limits pledge or has taken a position one way or another, you'll be the first person to hear about it. And that is really how we grow our activist network. And that is how we are successful at this, because we really need to overwhelm the political class with the power of grassroots activism. We need 10 or 15 people eventually at town hall meetings in term limit shirts, insisting that every candidate sign the pledge. And that is ultimately what will make us successful at the state level and at the federal level, because as I mentioned, we get no help from the establishment. So that's the one thing I would suggest. If people want to stay engaged with us, go to termlimits.com, sign the petition, and get involved, because we would really appreciate your help.
Yeah. And of course, that's the website is scrolling across the ticker on the bottom. Nick, what about social media where people could check you out?
Yeah, we have a Facebook account that's got close to 1 million supporters on there from across the states, where we also share news and updates and highlights of which legislation we have that's active and what kind of progress is being made. That's a great place to engage with us. So, like and share our content on Facebook. We also have a Twitter account at US Term Limits. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook.
Okay. Any final thoughts? Is there anything that I missed that you think you needs to be brought up?
Um, that's a good question. I think you pretty much
Okay, good.
covered
I
everything.
did my job then. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Nick Tomboulides, for discussing this important issue with us today. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Robert. I really appreciate you. Thank you for
All right.
having us and
Thanks,
for
Nick.
your support.